So as Gareth said, we're in our Vision series. All of the previous ones are on our YouTube channel if you need to catch up with any of them. And we've been working through the first kind of part of our vision to get to the point of looking at spiritual disciplines. One of the things we saw early on is that formation or transformation will happen, and it will happen with no effort on your part. But formation into the likeness of Jesus will not. That's something we have to choose and keep on choosing day after day. It requires us to be intentional. We looked earlier on at these two triangles. I'm hoping the screen will allow us to see them. So the first one is kind of what happens when we are unintentionally being spiritually formed. What happens if we do nothing? Well, we're shaped by a combination of the stories we believe, the habits that we operate with, the relationships we have, and the environment we're in. And all of those things shape us over time. That's what just happens naturally. If we want to be focused on choosing to be discipled to Jesus, we see this one instead. So we have teaching at the top there, and that's why we're doing a teaching series like this. We're trying to convey truth about how it is we become disciples and take that seriously. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at community, that we're committed to raising generations. We do this as community. We can't follow Jesus on our own. We need those who are ahead of us in the journey, and we also need to look to those who are not as far along the journey as we are. Last time we had Jack speaking about being spirit-filled disciples. Instead of the environment, we are carriers of God's presence. That's the middle bit of the triangle there. Living in an awareness of God's presence. And then instead of, what does it say? Instead of habits, we have practices at the bottom left. And that's what we're looking at this week and next week. Practices. So all of us have different habits. We all have presumably a morning routine for getting ready and out of the house. That's a set of habits that we live with day by day that get us ready for the rest of the day. We all have habits in all areas of life, and they are forming us into a particular kind of person. And so as disciples of Jesus, we have certain practices that we can choose to do regularly that will help to shape us more into the likeness of Jesus. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, this amazing collection of Jesus' teachings, he says, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, so hearing them is not enough, knowing them is not enough, who puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. So we're thinking about the practices of Jesus, also called the spiritual disciplines, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But you might remember me saying a few weeks ago that practice is not about trying hard, but training hard. Training and not trying. Like a number of people here at St Matthew's, I can play a little bit of piano. Now imagine, for some inexplicable reason, Birmingham Symphony Hall phone me tomorrow morning and book me to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in the autumn. And let's assume for some inexplicable reason I say yes. How am I going to be ready for that? One option would be to just get hold of the music, sit down at the piano and try really hard to play the piece from start to finish. But I'll be honest with you, that piece is far beyond my ability. It is simply out of reach for a pianist like me. And so I would give up pretty quickly. Another option would be to train really hard every day, practicing scales, learning chords, diving into a bit of music theory. And eventually that training might get me to the point where Rachmaninoff is within reach, just not by the autumn. Training hard, not trying hard. Paul often uses the example of athletes and racing. A number of times, Acts 20:24, I consider my life worth nothing to me if only I may finish the race the Lord Jesus has given me. Or Galatians 5:7, you were running a good race. Who cut in on you? 1 Timothy 6, but you, man of God, flee from all this and run after righteousness. 2 Timothy 4, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And then in our reading just now, everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, a crown made of leaves. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Now he's writing this to the church in Corinth, which was the site of the Isthmian Games, tricky word to say, second only to the Olympics in ancient Greece. Paul had probably been in Corinth during the Games in AD 51. It's possible that that's somewhere that he made lots of tents for people to shelter in during the Games. But his point that he's making here is nobody can just turn up at the Games and just try hard. In fact, it was a requirement. Any athlete who entered the Games was required to undergo 10 months of strict training. And they could actually be disqualified if they failed to do that training. And so Paul said that he himself had entered a life of training as a disciple of Jesus, so that after proclaiming to others, I myself should not be disqualified. Everyone who competes in the Games goes into strict training. We could say that a different way. Everyone who competes in the Games is disciplined in their training. Discipline is key. Last time I preached, I told you about my first run after a few months off, and I guess I kind of thought that just getting out there and trying would get me back into it. But I'll be honest with you, I haven't been running since. I need to get back into training. Everyone who competes in the Games is disciplined in their training. Paul says that's what discipleship looks like. The need for training applies just as much to the art of forgiveness, or joy, or courage, or thankfulness. And we can't stress this enough, really. How often have you heard a good sermon or had a really good discussion with someone, or maybe a life group, and you wake up the next day determined to be better at following Jesus? You know, you might wake up thinking, I'm going to be more patient. I'm going to love my enemies. I'm going to be more joyful. And how often did that approach work for you? Trying hard can only accomplish so much. If we're serious about pursuing transformation, we have to enter a life of training, to arrange our lives around certain practices that will enable us to become more like Jesus and do more of what Jesus did. And traditionally, these practices have been called spiritual disciplines. One of the key books on this is called Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster, and he discusses 12 of these disciplines. And there's two ways you might be going as you think about that. You might be thinking, well, look, I already feel guilty about not reading the Bible or praying enough. The last thing I need is 10 other things to feel guilty about not doing. On the other hand, you might be thinking, great, give me a list of the other 10. I'll devise a master plan, and by the end of tomorrow, they'll all be fully integrated into my routine. And if you were to try that, I suspect, like me with Rachmaninoff, you'd give up quite quickly. Maybe you'd conclude that only monks and nuns could possibly even begin to do it. So before we get to what spiritual disciplines are, let's consider a few things that they're not. Spiritual disciplines are not a measure of maturity. Let me explain what I mean. It's likely, of course, that a more mature disciple will have a more rigorous training schedule. They're likely to practice more spiritual disciplines. And on the flip side, a less mature disciple will probably have a more chaotic training schedule and practice fewer spiritual disciplines. But a training schedule on its own is not a measure of maturity. Spiritual disciplines are only a means to an end. Like a footballer practicing penalties over and over again on the training ground, you don't get any goals or any credit for the shots you made in practice. The only reason to practice them is that you might score the penalty in the game itself. And so in the same way, the spiritual disciplines they're activities that we practice so that we can become more like Jesus in our everyday lives. And so love is the main metric, the main thing we might measure for spiritual maturity. Secondly, spiritual disciplines are not necessarily unpleasant. You might just be put off by the word discipline. Think of them as practices if you need to. But what makes something a discipline depends on what we're training for. If we're training for a triathlon, there's a certain set of activities that you will practice. But if you're training for a pie eating contest, you're likely to focus on something different. What counts as training is determined by what we are training for. And we might assume that just to count as a discipline, it has to be arduous and difficult, something that we'd rather not do. But we're training for a life characterized by love, joy, peace, patience. And so we should assume that some of the practices are actually going to be fun. Many of the practices from the life of Jesus are incredibly joyful. Sabbath, sleep, feasting, gratitude, celebration, worship. Others become joyful the more we practice them. Thirdly, spiritual disciplines are not a way to earn favour. We're not training in order to become good enough or to earn God's blessing or favour. We're not earning extra credit or showing our commitment to God. The spiritual disciplines exist primarily for our benefit and not God's. They only have value insofar as they help us be transformed more into the likeness of Jesus. At the same time, that means they're not for the benefit of others either. Jesus actually warns us against practicing these disciplines in order to be seen by others. If you do these practices for the wrong reasons, they can actually end up working against our formation. And then fourthly, spiritual disciplines are not a means of control. Again, let me explain that. We could easily end up thinking that this is what we do to get the results we want in our emotional and spiritual life. We're attempting to manipulate our lives in order to avoid discomfort or even pain. If I pray enough, if I fast enough, if I practice enough, then my problems will disappear. Folks, sadly, that's not how it works. The practices are how we meet God in the reality of our daily lives, including in our pain. And they help us to deepen our surrender to God, that we might allow God to do what God wills when he wills. So those are some things that spiritual disciplines are not. So let's move on. What makes something a discipline? There's a bit of a definition on the screen here. A discipline is any activity I can do by direct effort that will eventually enable me to do that which currently I cannot do by direct effort. This is like me with Rachmaninoff again. I cannot sit down and play Piano Concerto No. 2. It's just beyond me. But I can sit down tomorrow and practice some scales and learn some new chords and all of that sort of stuff. That's something I can do. And if I were to do that consistently over time, I might eventually become the kind of person who can sit at the piano and play Rachmaninoff. The disciplines allow us to do what we can't do by willpower alone. John Ortberg, in his book on all of this, uses an example from a children's book called Frog and Toad Together. A set of kind of children's, it's like a bit like Biff and Chipper, I think, looking at the covers of them. And the central characters, Frog and Toad, discover the limits of willpower and just trying when Frog bakes a batch of cookies. We ought to stop eating, they say, as they keep eating. We must stop, they resolve, as they eat some more. We need some willpower, Frog finally says, grabbing another cookie. What's willpower? Asks Toad, swallowing another mouthful. Willpower is trying very hard not to do something that you want to do very much, Frog says. And then Frog discusses a variety of ways to help with willpower. Putting the cookies in a box, tying the box shut, putting it high up in a tree. But each time, Toad points out, in between mouthfuls, that they could just climb the tree and untie the box. Until finally, in desperation, Frog dumps the remaining cookies on the ground for the birds to eat. Now we have no more cookies, Toad says sadly. Yes, says Frog, but we have lots and lots of willpower. You can keep it, Toad replies. I'm going home to bake a cake. There is a limit to how far willpower and trying on its own can get us. Discipline is doing what we can do now that helps us become the kind of person that can do things that are beyond us just at the minute. And then spiritual disciplines, then, are activities we choose to practice that train us to become more like Jesus and do the things Jesus did. Spiritual disciplines are to following Jesus what practicing scales are to learning the piano. It's our training regime. Here are some other definitions from some of the others that are kind of reading and writing about this. This is John Mark Comer's definition. He says, the practices are disciplines based on the lifestyle of Jesus that create time and space for us to access the presence and power of the Spirit, and in doing so, be transformed from the inside out. And then this one from one of his mentors, Dallas Willard. The disciplines are activities of mind and body purposefully undertaken to bring our personality and total being into effective cooperation with the divine order. They enable us more and more to live in a power that is, strictly speaking, beyond us, deriving from the spiritual realm itself as we yield ourselves to God. We said earlier on, didn't we, that this, in the series, that this transformation comes ultimately from God alone. We are being transformed by Jesus. But the spiritual disciplines are our part in that process of transformation. It's how we open ourselves up to what God is wanting to do in us. And so let me finish just by naming some of the spiritual disciplines so you know where we're kind of heading later on and next week. There's no official list, there's no definitive list, because in a sense anything can become a spiritual discipline if it opens us up to the transformation God is working in our lives. But there are some core practices from the life of Jesus for all of us. And we're going to be looking at some of these in depth later in the year. Here's some of the more prominent ones. We've got Sabbath, solitude, prayer, fasting, scripture, community, generosity, service, witness. Transformation is possible if we choose to arrange or rearrange our lives around these practices from the life of Jesus. The practices of Jesus are not the end goal. Remember, the practices are about training for something. The end goal is transformation, being transformed by Jesus, becoming like him in order that we might do the things Jesus did. And so for this week, I just want to leave us with this question. If you were to look at your current practices, all the habits and practices that you do regularly, not just the spiritual ones, but all of the practices that shape your life right now, if you were to look at those, what would somebody conclude you are training for?